Remember that God remembers you.
Remember that God will make your name great.
Remember that God made you to bless.
Remember that God treasures your tears.
Remember that God is drawing you out into more faith.
Remember that God goes before you and he sets the pace.
Remember that God makes this covenant a covenant of grace.
Remember that God desires to free you, not based on the depth of your faith.
Remember that God is your source of true rest and restoration.
Remember that God asks you to rest because you are more than you produce.
Remember that God's rest draws you into deeper presence with Him.
Remember that God made you to be present with Him. Remember that God redeems and releases you to run with purpose.
Remember that God's command resets and redirects our souls.
Remember that God's command reveals and reorders our loves.
Remember that God's command reunites us with the undivided one.
Remember that God shapes us morally and missionally.
Remember that God has given you a personal story to tell.
Remember that God calls you to declare and display His love.
Remember that God calls us to tell about Him together.
Remember that God has forgiven you and remembers your sin no more.
Remember that God has reconciled you to Himself and you can reconcile with others.
Remember the poor.
Remember your leaders.
Remember who you are.
Remember to help the weak.
Remember to serve.
Remember that God's Spirit empowers you.
Remember that the Holy Spirit is your comforter.
Remember together.
Keep remembering.